Hey Lixos, Necrit here. Amai, mother, fa'ir, father, svag. Language. We all know it, we all use it. And once in a while people decide to make up new ones and help with immersion in their fictional worlds. Famously, J.R.R. Tolkien made up 2 Elvish languages, Quenya and Sindarin, in such a detail that they can serve as fully functioning languages. Similarly, I'm sure many of you heard about people having wedding ceremonies in Star Trek's Klingon language. This act of creating new, unheard of languages became so popular that over time, writers started hiring linguists to create new languages for their work. And in 1974, it was Victoria Fromkin who became the first person to be hired to create a language. Which means that her Pakuni language in the Land of the Lost television series became the first professionally created language. Since then, the art of supporting mythologies with unique tongues evolved. And these days, unique languages can be found in all media. Most importantly for us, they also appear in video games. Unlike how they behave in books, in video games the different languages are established at the beginning, and then they are ignored to make sure players can understand everyone. In World of Warcraft, the undead have their gutter speak, the orcs speak Orcish, humans speak Common, but the undead can't speak Common despite them technically being humans. It's set up in such a way that everyone on the Horde side can speak Orcish, and everyone on the Alliance side can speak Common. But then, when you get to cutscenes, everyone magically uses the same language, despite there being no cross-faction talking.
Watch your clever mouth!
This ignoring of different languages, so that us, the players, can understand every spoken word in a story, plagues almost every video game, including, to the surprise of many, our beloved League of Legends. Many of you may not even know it, but League actually has many different languages, which means that the vast majority of the champions wouldn't even be able to talk to each other. You know how every time Skin Spotlights releases an interaction video, and people are not sure whether what the champions are saying is canon? Well, this is why we always have to remember that the interactions reference what would the champions say if they met, and even so, it is still ignoring the fact that most champions wouldn't even understand each other. Over time, right after the release of Aurelion, as Riot started updating different regions, they also started giving them each their own unique traits. And these regional traits also included languages. At first, Riot didn't really do anything with them. They might have mentioned that someone from the north might have a rough accent and someone from the west might have a soft accent. But these accents go a lot deeper, especially since they are linked to their own unique languages. First, let's check out the simple ones. During the times when Piltover was first updated, and we got the Medarda map, it was mentioned that as Noxian spies invaded Piltover, if they did harm to the city, the Piltovans were able to tell them apart from the locals because of their accents. As far as we know, Piltover itself only really has 2 main languages. It is a trade city after all, so they can speak everything here. But mainly, there is Piltovan and Zonite. Unfortunately, we don't know much about these languages. But we know that the Zonite language came from the original city of Zon, called Oshravazon, which was an ancient Shuriman city. This makes it sound like this language obviously has roots in Shuriman. But Noxus has had influence on Zon for so long, it is possible that the Zonite language would originate from somewhere else. Either way, Piltovan is really just a modernized version of that, with the main difference between the two being the accents and the slangs. In fact, in Malphite's story, we got a few phrases from a Zonite miner using the Zonite argot. For example, "Heed you was essay on a square, was big teams taken," could be translated as "We heard you were a good essayer, but we were sorely mistaken." That's where our information on the Piltovan language ends. Fortunately, other regions get a lot more interesting for us. Like Noxus, for example. The Immortal Bastion, which would later become the capital city of the Noxian Empire, was built by Mordekaiser. But Mordekaiser wasn't even his real name. Spoken in the language of the Noxai tribes, his name was San Uzao, which could be translated as Mordekaiser using Oknun, the language of the dead. Years later, as Noxus became an empire which was all about uniting people, through killing them. They also started using a unified language, the Nox, or Noxian, which changes slightly depending on which Noxian tribe you come from. Those different iterations of this language also get their own names, such as Vanox, or Vanoxian. An example of an Noxian word would be the Noxtora, which can be translated as the gateway to Noxus, with the Noxtoras being these black stone gates built on all Noxian roads. Interestingly, it wasn't until Fiddlesticks got his update that we finally saw a written version of the Noxian. Or to be more specific, that's when it was confirmed that this is Noxian. In reality, it first appeared in Tahm Kench's teaser, but back then we didn't have any info on it. At first, people believed that the demonic compendium was written in a demonic language, but later we learned that it was actually written by Noxian mages, as they were trying to decipher how demons work. And from that point on, the written version of Noxian started appearing in other places too. Rel's wanted poster was actually written in Noxian, despite it still spelling out wanted. But what's even cooler, in Legends of Runeterra, when Tahm Kench levels up, you can see that he made a deal with someone called Jack, and that deal was written in Noxian. Considering the fact that Noxus had such a big influence on Runeterra, that the Runeterran years are actually counted BN or AN, that is before or after Noxus, there is the possibility that the Noxian seeped into the majority of the surrounding regions. For example, when it comes to Demacia, we know they have their own Demacian language. Both the ancient version, which was used during the times of Kael and Morgana, and which likely originated from Targon, and the modern version that is used now. However, because Demacia was essentially built by people who were running away from the Rune Wars, meaning that people from all over the world fled here, it means that the Demacian language started as a mix of everything, including the already spread out Noxian, and it was shaped into the modern Demacian over time. Remember that the Rune Wars happened only 13 years before the Noxian Empire was founded, so at the very least the Noxian language had already started creeping out. When it comes to the written form of Demacian, it is very difficult to find any of it, because whenever it appears somewhere, it is usually written in English, so that the readers can actually read it. But if you go to the Wild Rift trailer, you can actually see Lux studying ancient Demacian alphabet. It's technically not canon, but we should still mention it. Besides that, this suspiciously rune-like writing can also be found on Jarvan's royal banners. But I know why you are all really here. You wanna hear about the swear words. In Freljord, Svag is one Sejuani often used both in the Ash comic and in her own stories. It essentially means fuck. It's a universal swear word. But besides that, being a region deeply rooted in the history of the entire Runeterra, the Freljord has a lot of hidden references to the ancient Freljordian, rather than the modern language they use there now. If you go back to the first Ornn teaser, which was an ancient song called The Path to Hearth Home, while we got the text translated to English, the original song was actually sung in ancient Freljordian. And so, it was cool to see that when it came to Volibear's rework, his theme, which is an Ursine battle hymn called Ode to Ruin, was also sung in the same language. And from this one, if you combine it with Volibear's quotes, we actually got a couple of words out of it. We know that Valir is Volibear's name in ancient Freljordian. We also know that Voryard is an ancient name of the Freljord in the same tongue. And according to the lyrics, Voryard calls you would be Voryard Kalir. And Voryard needs you would be Voryard Beoft. If you really wanna go deep into this, the League Wiki wrote down all the words from this song. Though you should take it with a pinch of salt, because we don't know if these words correlate to the translation word for word. The syntax might be different. But now we got too far from the interesting territory. So let's go back to swear words. The only other one which we got confirmed comes from Ionia. The Ionian language is probably the most diverse one, because you have ancient human Ionian, which Yasuo shouts while fighting, and which Karma randomly uses. Then there is modern human Ionian, which everyone uses these days. You have all the languages which come from all the different Vastayan tribes. Zaya would have something to say about that.
That was a Vastayan farewell.
Isn't a Vastayan farewell when you say Ulabash?
I was trying to have a moment, Rakan.
And then even some tribes which date back to the Vastaya Shirei, which technically come from a totally different island with its own unique language. Nico is a good proof of that.
Oh, Sehena. Oh, it means like, we smile forever. France! That is the word! France!
And on top of that, you have Noxians, once again invading their lands to spread the word about Noxian. But interestingly, in Master Yi's story, when he was going through the visions that showed what we know to be the first ever beginnings of Runeterra's history, there he met the original mortal souls of the Vastaya Shirei, who were fighting the ancient giants. And those Vastaya Shirei also spoke in their own language. But we are not sure if that's the same, though older, version of Nico's language. So going back to the swear words. In modern Ionian, there is the word Zir, or Ziri when it is targeted at a person, which could roughly be translated as misfortune. This word was used against Yasuo in his own story, and it was also used in the Sisterhood of War series, against the invading Noxians. Now, misfortune may not really sound like a swear word, but that's because Ionians tend to soften things up. In reality, with context, the real meaning of the word Ziri is fuck you. And speaking of diverse languages, then we have Bilgewater, the exact opposite, which is literally just a collection of whoever ends up on these isles. So the locals here speak all the languages, with only one language being native to this place, the Buhuru, which is linked to the ancient priests worshipping the god of motion, Nagageboros. But besides the Buhuru themselves, no one else is really using the language. Next to these we have the former Blessed Isles, which we don't actually know much about, though we know that they were in contact with the surrounding nations such as Ishtal, Ionia and Shrima. So the locals, being really advanced in general, could definitely also speak these languages. And speaking of Ishtal, that's the one nation that is as simple as it can get. The story of this region was actually really well explained in Malphite's story, but if I had to simplify it, the Ishtali were afraid that the void would consume the world, and so they wrapped their entire region in a bubble made of plants, which means that their language couldn't really get mixed with anything else. And so the old Ishtali language probably stayed the same as the modern version. Kiana even shouts a few words in-game.
You dare raise a hand against your rightful ruler? Estem kayede!
But we never really learned what they mean. Who knows, some of them can be swear words.
Sal Yunescunya!
Anyway, next, in Shrima. Their native language evolved over time, but it really started changing when the Sun Disk fell, and the region started being explored by outsiders. So theoretically, we can divide it into ancient and modern Shriman. But what's interesting about it is that the Shriman language developed a really cool way of handling names. First, they have a special way of naming the Voidborn. We don't really know the real meaning behind these specific words, but we know that all Voidborn have to have an apostrophe in their name. That's why there is Cho'Gath, Ka-Zix, or Vel'Koz. In fact, before Kai'Sa was corrupted by the Void, she was simply called Kai'Sa. But after people started thinking that she was yet another Voidborn monster, they started calling her not Kai'Sa, but Kai'Sa. On top of this, Shrimans tend to combine their names with the place they come from. So for example, when someone comes from one of the villages in the Great Desert, they are called Sai, because in Shriman, Sai means desert. That's why on the map you have the Great Sai. So for example, Jax was originally called Sai-Jax, translated as Jax of the Desert. Similarly, Rek'Sai can be translated as the Scourge of the Desert, with her species, the Zersai, being named after her. But other people may have entire cities or kingdoms in their names. For example, in the Where Icathia Once Stood story, the main character was called Aksamuk Varchoi Koari Ikathor. Aksamuk Varchoi is his name, with the direct translation being something like Aksamuk of the Choi family. Koari then means that he was one of the elite Koari warriors, and Ikathor means that he comes from the kingdom of Icathia. And lastly, there is also Mount Targon. Just like Demacia, Targon is a place where people from all over the world gathered. In fact, people first got onto Targon after an event called the Great Western Migration. But still, the Targonian language is unique to this place. Though all we really know about it is that the writing is inspired by the star constellations, and that despite the Lunari and the Solari being two separate tribes now, they all seem to be using the same language. Now, although this would cover all the languages of all the regions that we know about, we can go beyond what was shown to us. For example, we know that while they were still alive, the Yetis of the Freljord had their own civilization, with its own language. In fact, the Yetis were incredibly smart, and these days only very few survivors from the days before the Three Sisters can understand them. Also, there is Nunu. Next, we know that the Celestials probably have their own language too, because when Leona was ascending the mountain, she met a golden Celestial whom she couldn't understand. Lastly, there are also the Yordles. The Yordles are already really good at mimicking appearances, using Glamour, which is a special spell that makes them look like something that people wouldn't want to kill at first sight. But also, although it was never mentioned anywhere, I wouldn't be surprised if the Yordles had their own language, and if they could speak to other beings simply because their Yordly magic was able to translate words for them. Remember, somehow Poppy was still able to talk to Orlon. But this is where we get into the sketchy bits. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, for the simplicity of a story, every now and then the rules of the languages have to be broken. And that happened to League of Legends many times in the past. There are many champions which really shouldn't be able to understand each other. For example, Azir should be using the ancient Shriman language, but still he can talk to people like Sivir. There are nations between Demacia and Noxus which seem to easily communicate with everyone. I mean, they can all be dual linguists, but it is strange to see the entire continent do that. And let's not even mention the Demacians and Noxians often contacting each other without an issue. Which also reminds me of a recent issue. Viego comes from the kingdom of Kamavor, which is on its own hidden continent. And yet, somehow, when Vladimir was transported from that continent to the Darkins of Valoran, Vladimir didn't seem to have any issues communicating with the locals and with the Darkin themselves, which should be using ancient Shriman. I mean, sure, Vladimir could probably learn their language, but being as egoistic as he is, do you think Viego would really learn a universal language so that he could talk to someone like Senna? There is the theory that Noxian is the core language of Runeterra, but even that theory has many holes. For example, someone like Xin Zhao traveled from Ionia to Noxus to Demacia, and I'm pretty sure he never had an issue talking to anyone, just like Udyr and Lee Sin. Or Olaf, who's literally from the other side of the world from Bilgewater, and he still talked to the local fishermen. So once again, this is a proof that once in a while, for the sake of simplicity, Riot had to throw the idea of multiple languages out the window. It's one thing to translate the language to English so that the consumer understands, but it is a different thing to ignore the multiple languages entirely. With that said, there were also stories where Riot did address champions not speaking the same language. For example, when Silas traveled to the Freljord, he couldn't understand the locals, and he needed a translator to talk to the Freljordians. And when Shen and Akali traveled to Piltover to find Jhin, Shen was such a boomer he couldn't even understand the people in Piltover. So Akali, knowing some Vanoxian from the invaders in Ionia, had to translate for him. Unfortunately, these self-reflected moments are few and far between, but when they do happen in the stories, it's a really cool immersive moment. As you can see, even a world such as Runeterra has to break its own rules sometimes to be immersive, while making sure that we do know about all of their separate languages. So the next time you decide to make a friend in League, call them Ko'om Sehena, Or if you wanna complain about Wild Rift getting another skin, shout out Swag. And as always, thanks for watching.